What happens when two people can look at the exact same number, a number representing trillions of dollars, and see two completely different realities? In a tense Senate hearing, a dramatic confrontation unfolds between Senator John Kennedy and a top administration official. Armed with shocking figures, the senator paints a grim picture of fiscal irresponsibility. A national debt spiraling from $33 to $51 trillion, and a catastrophic banking failure that regulators should have seen coming. Yet, the official offers a starkly different interpretation, one where a massive increase in debt is somehow an improvement, and where crucial warnings about a failing bank fall outside her purview. This exchange is more than just a debate over policy. It's a battle over the nature of truth itself in the halls of power. The question we must ask is not simply who is right, but rather, is this a masterful display of holding power to account, or a calculated piece of political theater designed to confuse and conquer?
Secretary, isn't it a fact that the president's proposed budget for next fiscal year is $500 billion more than this fiscal year?
On the spending side?
Yes. That's what a budget is.
Yeah. It is about $400 billion.
It's about $500 billion more, right?
It's about what?
$500 billion more, right?
About that.
Isn't it a fact that since 2019 until today, I'm not including the extra $500 billion that y'all want to spend, since 2019 through today, U.S. population has increased 1.8%, and the federal government's budget is up 55%. Isn't that a fact?
Well, we had a pandemic.
Isn't that a fact, though? Are my numbers right?
I don't know those numbers.
You don't know? You never looked at that?
I don't have those numbers in my head. I'm not disputing them.
Okay. Isn't it a fact that the president's proposed budget proposes $4.7 trillion in new taxes?
It does propose significant additional taxes, yes.
4.7 trillion?
Something like that, yes.
Okay. You talked about reducing deficit. Isn't it a fact that under President Biden's proposed budget, that gross debt will rise from $32.7 trillion at the close of this year to $51 trillion by 2033?
I'm sorry, what number did you give me for?
The president's proposed budget will increase gross debt from $33 trillion at the close of this year to $51 trillion in 2033. Isn't that correct?
Well, debt held by the public, which is...
No, ma'am, that's gross debt. Isn't that a fact?
That's probably a fact.
So you haven't reduced the deficit, have you?
The deficit, the debt and deficits are reduced by the president's budget.
How can you go from $33 trillion to $51 trillion and call that a reduction in the deficit?
Because that's a calculation for which you need a baseline, and then you compare the budget and the deficits and debt in the budget with a baseline in which there are none of the changes, either in revenues or in spending, that are proposed in the budget.
Here's my baseline. At the end of this year, we project, people a lot smarter than me, probably not than you, but smarter than me, say that gross debt's $33 trillion. They say if the president's budget is implemented by 2033, it'll be $51 trillion. Isn't that a fact?
If the president's budget is not implemented and none of the changes are made, it will be worse than that. And so the president's budget has improved the fiscal outlook relative to what we would have without the president's proposals.
Even though it raises gross debt from $33 trillion to $51 trillion, you say that's an improvement?
It is an improvement because it raises taxes by more, and it leads to...
That includes taxes. In what world is that an improvement, other than Washington and La La Land?
It's an improvement in that the revenue increases far exceed proposed investments.
Okay. All right, let me ask you this. Isn't it a fact that in January of 2019, the Federal Reserve issued a warning to Silicon Valley Bank over its risk management systems?
I have no idea. I'm not responsible in any way.
But you're in charge of the banking bailouts and the crisis, right?
I am not involved in banking supervision, and I don't have access to any information about the supervision of Silicon Valley Bank.
Okay, so you don't know whether or not the Fed, you haven't looked to see whether or not the Fed issued a warning, 4 years ago to the bank over its risk management systems?
That's not public information, and it's not
Sure it is.
information.
It's in the Wall Street Journal.
Well, it may be in the Wall Street Journal, but it's not public information, and it's not information that I have access to.
Well, I'll give you a copy of this article.
I've read the article, but...
The Fed issued a matter requiring attention. And it said your risk management practices are terrible and you need to improve them.
That is what the article says.
Right. Isn't it a fact that months before SVB went under, that the bank disclosed that its mark-to-market value of its bonds was $16 billion less than their balance sheet value?
They did make such a statement.
Yeah. Did the people at the Federal Reserve just not read it?
I'm not at the Federal Reserve.
I know.
I was at the Federal Reserve.
But you're at the Treasury, and you're in charge of the banking crisis. Let me ask you.
I am not in charge of the supervision of the bank.
Let me ask you this. Senator Hinder talked about the 2018 amendments to the Dodd-Frank Act. Isn't it a fact? Now, SVB was not stress tested in 2022. 34 banks were. Here's the Fed's report. Isn't it a fact that if SVB had been stress tested, it would have passed?
Stress tests look at capital of a bank.
Here's the yes, ma'am. Under the stress test, isn't it a fact that SVB would have passed?
I don't know. It wasn't stress tested.
You need to look into that, Madam Secretary.
This is not my job. This is the Federal Reserve's job.
Okay, isn't it a fact that when the Federal Reserve stress tested in 2022, it only stress tested credit risk, it didn't stress test duration risk? Isn't that a fact?
I believe the stress tests in general partially address and take account of interest rate
No,
risk.
ma'am. I've read it. Here it is, bigger than Dallas.
Well, to the extent that there are assets held in an available for sale portfolio that would suffer losses due to changing interest rates, that would be captured in the bank's...
No, ma'am.
To understand the explosive exchange we've just witnessed, we must dissect the calculated methodology of the questioner, Senator John Kennedy. His performance was not a simple inquiry. It was a masterclass in prosecutorial storytelling, designed to construct a specific narrative of incompetence and fiscal decay before a national audience. The senator's argument was built on a two-pronged attack. First, he established a foundation of alarming, context-free numbers. By forcing the secretary to confirm a $500 billion budget increase, a $7 trillion tax proposal, and a projected gross debt increase from $33 to $51 trillion, he framed the administration's policies as objectively reckless. The core of this strategy was his deliberate conflation of rising national debt with a rising deficit. When the secretary attempted to explain the technical budget concept of a baseline, arguing that the president's budget reduces the deficit relative to a future scenario of inaction, Kennedy seized upon the apparent contradiction. His incredulous retort, In what world is that an improvement? Was a powerful rhetorical device. It dismissed the complex explanation as bureaucratic doublespeak and appealed to a common-sense understanding that more debt cannot possibly be good. This is a classic example of a straw man argument, where he ignores her actual point about baseline comparisons and instead attacks the simplified, absurd-sounding idea of calling a debt increase a reduction. The second prong of his attack was a swift, jarring pivot to the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. This transition was strategically designed to link the abstract theme of fiscal mismanagement to a tangible, real-world disaster, implying a single, overarching pattern of failure. The strategic goal here was clear: not to uncover new information, but to use the hearing as a stage to solidify a political narrative for public consumption. His questions were not open-ended. They were leading, fact-based assertions framed as, "Isn't it a fact that..." A tactic that forces the witness into a defensive posture of either confirming his premise or appearing evasive. Kennedy's demeanor was central to the execution of his strategy. His tone was not that of an inquisitive legislator, but of a cross-examining prosecutor. It was persistent, skeptical, and bordered on condescending, particularly in his repeated use of "no ma'am" to cut off explanations that deviated from his intended narrative path. His language was deliberately populist and vivid. Phrases like "bigger than Dallas" or his reference to Washington and Long Island are not accidental. They are crafted to create a connection with an audience outside the Beltway, contrasting his supposed straight talk with the perceived elitist jargon of the official. This style served a crucial purpose. It projected an image of absolute control by setting the pace, dictating the terms of the debate, and refusing to engage with nuanced answers. He dominated the exchange and ensured his narrative remained the focal point. His adaptation to the secretary's responses was particularly telling. When she answered that she had no knowledge of the Federal Reserve's warnings to SVB, citing her lack of supervisory authority, Kennedy did not relent. Instead, he skillfully countered by citing a Wall Street Journal article, effectively transforming her defense from a legitimate jurisdictional boundary into an admission of being uninformed about publicly reported information. This was his most effective moment, as it allowed him to challenge her credibility without having to disprove her core claim about her official duties. He consistently demonstrated an unwillingness to listen, frequently interrupting and speaking over the secretary. Her attempts to provide context about the pandemic's impact on spending, or the specifics of how interest rate risk is partially captured in stress tests, were immediately shut down. He maintained absolute control over the narrative flow, never allowing the conversation to drift into the complexities where her arguments might find purchase. In conclusion, Senator Kennedy's performance was less an exercise in legislative oversight and more a powerful piece of political theater. He employed a structured, evidence-based line of questioning, not to seek understanding, but to build an unassailable narrative brick by brick. By combining a prosecutorial demeanor with a masterful control of the narrative and a keen ability to counter defensive maneuvers, he successfully painted the picture he intended from the outset. The answer to our initial question, then, becomes clear. While it contained elements of accountability, this was overwhelmingly a calculated performance, a strategic communication exercise aimed at a court far larger than the hearing room, the court of public opinion. What do you think of this exchange? Was Senator Kennedy's approach a necessary form of accountability or a partisan performance? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more in-depth analyses.